Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you for all the people you thanked. And it's good to be back here in the grass that doesn't have bugs. This was lovely about Michigan, actually. You can lie down in the grass. It was the same thing in the Carpathians, where I grew up. Actually, you could lie down in the grass, and things didn't eat you up. Well, I'll read a few works, and then it's interesting, the business about Sweden and Tranströmer, because I was in Sweden not so long ago, and I wrote a few poems, so I will read some of those too, for those of you who heard that or might be interested. So I quit teaching not so long ago because I couldn't take it anymore. And this has some Detroit references as well. So this is called History and Poetry class, but poetry is between parentheses. Yelping for the proletariat. It must be the 30s. That's Walker Evans. And that's Diego in Detroit. Everybody on the train is reading a USSR travel book. That was in the 20th century. It's 2010 now. The bourgeoisie can only achieve contentment through the unhappiness of artists who can wreck that contentment through ecstasy. Suffering artists are promoted to the expense of ecstatics and mystics. We are at the ceremony but pretend to be elsewhere. Which is what the Tretiakov galleries meant to say all along. Class analyzed the 20th century in the following keys. 1. Freud. 2. Jung. 3. Marx. 4. Fashion. 5. The Kabbalah. 6. The news. 7. Art. 8. Advertising. 9. The future. 10. The assignment. I would rather be in you than with you. But here we are, artists and analysts, all mixed up. Like parts of the gun, each one of you has been assigned at the beginning of your social class. Pay attention. This is the clip. Every thought, symmetry. What sounds, what you hear, matter. Each bullet is you. The imperative is to think in piano keys that are actually bullets. This man with the shovel is a digger. I found him on the vacant lot as I was looking for something to bring to show and tell. When I found him, he had just finished digging a new rift in American education, a trench. And now, class, he will dig something for you. He'll find the interstices in the trenches he's digging. That's where the candy is hidden. In your machine guns. The earth might collapse on him. Whatever happens, don't move. Keep breaking down and putting back together. Your gun, your clip, your life, your ambitions. This terrain was made for you and me, even if it looks like Belgium at first. It's both narrative and complicated, but it moves forward. Load your gadgets and note how fast he digs your grave. Fear of heights doesn't matter when you're in this deep. Last week's assignment, invent poet. Here is a good one from Mrs. Ohio. I'll read it out loud. Hannah Temet lives in Barcelona. She works as an assistant to film director Pedro Almodovar. She has published a bilingual poetry collection, Telesintesa, Libros Jose Corti. I read it, translated it, emailed it to the class. I hope it's a third of my grade. Here is an example of Miss Temet's work. Mira, pierced tangent, named quickly, oblique or furtive. I know you. No, you don't. Yes, I do. Play pinnacle with this reed, with those lips, pitched roof so steep the dark tastes soft like you. Hannah Temet lives in Barcelona with her girlfriend of 3 years, Elena. One day she goes to the temp office and she's sent to a sound studio on Avenida X to do office work for a couple of guys making a soundtrack for a film by Pedro Almodovar's nephew, Corinta. She shows Pedro her poetry. A+. There are a lot of poets, and you must meet them all. I have. There is only a slight vowel difference between fetal and fatal. The difference is you. Discuss. Also, discuss. If buzzards had dollars, would they eat carryout? Goes for crows, too. Discuss also. Are Crystal, Amber, and Ginger the three muses of the strip mall? And this, is Adam a typo? You, up front, manipulate the word. It doesn't move by itself. Here are some things I learned. Most people are fat and violent. No generalization without penetration. If you can see it on TV, you don't need it in a book. Communism didn't collapse. It exploded like Elvis. Clitoris dweller, cliff dweller is an oxymoron. When you have these types of learning, you are me. Thank you. I didn't know it ended so abruptly. Well, it's the problem with some poems, you know, they end before you're ready for that. And so in the same sort of vein, more or less, I was living in New Orleans. Well, actually, I'm still living in New Orleans when the BP, BP almost destroyed the Gulf. I mean, they did. So I wrote this called The Gulf of Mexico, Social Realism. These giants, oil engines behind the scenes at night, they're working for you, even when they look like they're making money for someone else. They do. The only thing that hurts these giants is the umbilical cords they're attached with to you. That one, just dangling with a puddle on the end, is the Gulf of Mexico. It used to be rich. All you need is a nice pair of scissors, then it will be aesthetic. You won't even know it was there, like a shrimp in reduction sauce. Wind, air, water, fire, when drafted, say, okay. Then they attach themselves to you with new umbilicums. Yummy. It feels yummy. Migratory birds know where to go. Something outside of them tells them where to go. Something inside them says yes, and then it's off to Mexico, but never again to the Gulf of Mexico. That's voided pedagogy. Dead verbs noun. Remember, derivative was once to derive, and so the body was derived from the need to feed, and the puddle dried up. Adjectives too had a hard time. But everything is fast now. Don't bet on language to be on your side. It's not. Not because it's venal, but because it's in constant use. If we gave our language a break for, let's say, a century, and kept quiet with our needs at a minimum, we might turn into finer animals. Horses, let's say. Evolution used to work that way. Now volition does. Teacher, teacher, what does my soul look like? A duck. I hate ducks. I like birds. I hate ducks. Will they make a difference to my grade? No, but now you're in charge of bodies in Area 51. They're morphing. How does language shape physiognomy? Why do the French look French? Do the people of the 20th century look different? Do plumbers? Do ideas? What makes them look like they do? Tolerance is important. Anybody who's ever made a fire knows why synergy is important. The hard thing is to know is when there is too much of it. People, your actions are ridiculous. The consequences tragic. Where is the Gulf of Mexico? Piñata in a buffet. See Last Will and Testament by Caligula Jr. Innocence is hard. Look at me. All these years. Whose dream are we? Our own. Which is the next question. Why are most things round? And the next. Will we ever be safe from the interior monologue? And the next. Does anyone know how to get lost anymore? And the one after, which we already asked. What disarms the reader? What weapon must he be relieved of? There will always be the exact same amount of God. Vomit is the price of liberty. I, for instance, feign amnesia during the daytime to hide from my own shadow. And that's just how it works. More or less. And now for a short work that, well, maybe not, but a long work that is beautifully musical so that you won't feel unhappy. This is based on an old Romanian legend, fairy tale story, an epic of three young builders who are building a church over a river that keeps falling down, and one of them, the youngest one, has a dream that the church will not stand until they build one of their wives into the wall. And so the two older builders tell their wives not to come with their lunch because they decide the first one to come with the lunch is going to be the one who will be built into the wall. And the two older ones tell their wives to stay home, but the younger one is innocent and believes in his dream, and his wife, of course, comes. He's in love, but he has to follow the rules of the rhymed epic. His name is Master Manole, and this is him speaking to Anna, his wife, who he built into the wall. Anna is immured. Anna immured in love by her loved one immured. Walked barefoot through the dew-steeped forest that stroked her toes with stretched roots and moss on that spring noon, alight with birdsong, holding her basket of warm bread, grapes, and wine. She stopped on the hill to watch me wield the trowel, a mason among masons, erecting our brick hymn to God, and then descended whistling to bring my lunch. And who was it heard the voice? Only the mad hear voices, and only the dumb listen. I am the dumb madman who, having heard the voice, told all the others what it said, and then, filled with hubris, swore to follow its crazed command. The first of our wives, I said, to bring our lunch we shall build into the wall, or else the church will not stand. Wall after wall has crumbled under us for 1 year now, but now I hear the voice that asks for binding blood. So, in my eagerness to be with Anna instead of burning in the sun, I heard this voice, the voice of my eagerness to love and dread of work, disguised as a divine command. Because all divine commands are only hidden faces of surrender. The older men I knew, they were masons, and I, an apprentice, they were skilled men who knew that voices lie. But the young are crazy enough to invent them, hear them, and make themselves believe. So they told their wives to stay home. And there stood my Anna alone in her fertile radiance. Fresh from the woods, she lay her basket on the linen towel she'd washed clean in the stream that morning. I built her body brick by brick into the church, whose walls will not stand without my bride's young breath within. Each brick went to its place, to her knees, waist, breasts, neck, and still she laughed, thinking it was a rough mason's joke, until the last brick in place covered her mouth, leaving only her why in the deep windows of her uncomprehending eyes. Anna immured now watches the lit tapers of the circling mass from inside the church wall that stands above the raging river. When pilgrims pass the wall where she's entombed, they hear her crying, "Why?" but go right by, oblivious of her why, to beg something or other of their God. Anna immured, eternity bound by Anna's blood. Anna immured by love, for love by one who loved her most, who fabricated and entrusted the voice that would bring him to her. Ah, fate, I am Manole, a fool, gambler, and a child. I cursed God, churches, bricks, masons, faith, and prophecy, and all that turned my Anna from woman into legend. I jumped into the Argesh River from the tower of the church that stands because my Anna lives within her walls. But death is no kinder than was my innocence and lying faith. I am no nearer to her than the bell clapper is to the clap of thunder. Anna immured cries, "Why?" Anna immured makes no room for answers I don't have. Anna immured, I have no answer to your why, and neither does the church bell calling the deluded and the meek to vespers, so that they'll trust the church itself to be the answer. Men with small hearts and minds blind with fear believed that the Mother of God immured herself within the dead body of her Son, immured there by a God who never answers, but whose church is thirsty for the blood of lovers to bind his walls, a God who injures love in love's name, the love that sent me flying from the tower to my death into the river, bringing me closer to Anna immured than the God of love, to love. Anna immured, Anna slows time to nothingness. As I keep building her body into the wall, from toes I kissed to breasts I cupped, to mouth that made me glad, I have not learned a thing from either her torment or my death. I am a mason and a liar, and I will always be one. I am the wall that will not stand unless I build my love within. I do not blame the villainy of my fellow builders who protected their wives by shielding them from death. No building stands without the sacrifice of love, and no building stands better and longer than one whose sacrifice is love itself, and no stone beauty comforts what survives. And I am all that can both create such monstrous belief and make himself believe it. Anna immured testifies that neither grandeur, faith, nor skill, nor goodness, nor goodwill, nor even death can stand before love's lie. I am the wall I built my love in with my own hands. Anna immured inside me stands asking, why? Anyway, the story is that actually the young builder did jump to his death from the roof of the finished church, so that's part of the actual legends. I am moved. I better get funny soon, or I'm going to believe it myself. It was a wonderful work in Portland that these architect and his friends saved. There was a freeway being torn down, and there were these columns where sort of a hobo artist in the 1940s created these works on the columns. He painted them there and slept under them, and then disappeared somewhere, and the artists in Portland loved it, and they wanted to save the columns, but it was a very difficult job of taking these giant cement things and transporting them somewhere else, and they finally did. It was called the Lovejoy Ramp, and this is a Portland, now a park actually in Portland, where they put these columns, and they finally get enough money to move them and make room for whatever came next. They moved them into a park that is not quite finished because they never, it's not quite finished, but they saved the work anyway. These murals were on the columns were fantasies and somewhat realistic and somewhat crazy of this, amazingly talented hobo artist who nobody knew anything about. So I went there they had a benefit to move the columns, and so I wrote this thing called Petite Epic for the Lovejoy Ramp to help them do this, so it became a little meditation on architecture, which is probably apt given, the nearness to Detroit here and its, contemporary ruins, and a petite epic for the Lovejoy Ramp, or eruptions of the marvelous and disaster architecture. I'm going to read this and then take a breath and read haikus. It's called a petite epic for the Lovejoy Ramp. The other day on the Nature Channel, I always wanted to start a poem, the other day on the Nature Channel. That being the only nature we get these days. Nature a channel among many. Next to the People Channel and the Disaster Channel, that would be the news. And the Sci-Fi Channel and the Mystery Channel. The other day on the Nature Channel, I saw that the perfect ball of iron spewed by the earth on an island near Madagascar several thousand years ago was hollowed out by a man and his sons who moved inside of it and were promptly declared gods by the natives who were allowed inside the ball once a year to get drunk and worship something called Orak, which was a huge petrified fish. I have it right over there under the table if anyone wants it. It's the prize for listening to me. And worship something called Orak, which was a huge petrified fish that zapped them when they touched it. And for having that experience, they paid the ball carvers in fish, goat, sorry goats, wherever you are, meat, grapes, and lizard kebabs. If you haven't them, they're incredibly horrible. Meanwhile, in Transylvania, my mother, who was in labor, watched a huge bomb fall from the sky and level the Church of the Immaculate Conception, where all our neighbors had taken shelter. And she gave birth to me, while a miraculous plume of smoke drifted upward and revealed a ruin beneath monstrous and shaped, shaped like a baying wolfhound. I sort of imagine it, but And she declared it aesthetically pleasing. And thanked the Virgin for having delivered her of aesthetics and of an ironic baby. Actually, all babies are ironic if you ask. Architecture, like Gaul, is divided into three parts. The part that comes courtesy of the Nature Channel, the part that comes thanks to the War Channel, and the part that comes from the Imagination Channel. And these three architectures, the architecture of nature, The architecture of ruins and the architecture of the imagination are the sons of disaster. The ball carver on the islands near Madagascar, and their mother is my mother, who warned me not to go near ruins when I was a child, but where else could I go when the whole town was a ruin, and the whole country I lived in was a ruin, and the world I was born into was a ruin. And the school I went to, the elementary school of the Ursulines, renamed the School of the Red Star, was the ruin of a convent, under which ran tunnels connecting one ruin to another. Tunnels that are also tombs that had been used in the Middle Ages to escape from invaders. Into the woods where we were safe in the arms of the nature channel. And the shapes of those ruins were as fantastic as the legends of my people who sank them in the ruins of their hovels to put the world back in some order after the sky and earth gods, the sons of disaster, had their way with the world. So, when I was about 14, I became an expert at making temporary houses in the shadows of cemeteries and crumbling walls, where I took first Marinella and then Aurelia. And there we lived for hours safe inside each other, and that was the architecture of adolescence, which builds shelters of mystery for the unfolding of its own mysteries. And that, to be perfectly honest, is the only architecture I care for. And I would like to see a collaborative project of urban adolescents from all ages describing the shelters they have made for their desire from the ruins of their cities. What is the eruption of the marvelous, if not the eruption of desire that rearranges the city according to its fancy, knowing that all architecture is born of disaster? Within every building there is another that can be found only by desire-driven adolescents, even official buildings of the state and the police, where tormented souls wait in endless antechambers under great vaults with trembling forms in their hands. Even there you will see a young sergeant or clerk find a secret place to gratify her imagination, and there is no building on earth that has not been rebuilt by the imagination to contain shelter from bright lights, nooks of darkness, chapels of selfhood, chambers and vaults for the song of Axis Mundi. 1 year after the dictator Ceausescu ordered the old center of Bucharest demolished, Byzantine churches and stately homes above all, the coldest winter in the history of the Carpathians froze all the rivers and the lakes, and in the spring, when they thawed, an intact 14th century basilica floated down the Danube and headed for the Black Sea, where it sank under the waves, joining Greek triremes and Roman warships and Turkish galleons and Venetian galley ships. And that was the real reason for the revolution and the end of the dictator. When I came to America, I saw history floating by and sinking under the waves of the present. Here, the architectures ruined one another almost as quickly as they rose. Having grown up and internalized disaster, in America, all buildings are temporary. Except for this one, it's terrific. Even the post offices and the churches and the museums were artifacts barely recovered from the shock of being moved across the oceans. Sorry. And the museums were artifacts barely recovered. I put the extra definitely article in there for you, Michelle. And the museums were artifacts barely recovered from the shock of being moved across oceans had to move again to a newer building. In America, a child could no longer see the place where she was born. A shopping mall stood there instead. In America, a child could no longer see the school where she learned the art of growing sad. A freeway went through there, now an overpass. Her memories of brick had turned to glass. The suburb went from white to black, and time had speeded up so much she had to stay young forever and reset the clock every 5 minutes just to know where was there. And there was everywhere, because she lived in time and not in any space. The future is in ruins before it is even built, a fact recognized, of course, by architects. A fact that grins shyly or demonically as it quotes ruins from other times and places. There are no buildings in America, only way stations that connect migratory floods, the most permanent architecture being precisely that which moves these floods from one future ruin to another. That is to say, freeways and skyways, and the car is our only shelter, the architecture of desire reduced to the womb. A womb in transit from one nowhere to another. That is one picture, but there are others. In New Mexico, the face of Jesus jumped on a tortilla. In Plaquemines, a virgin projected on a tree. In Santuario de Chimayo, the dirt turned healer. A guy in Texas crashed into a wall when God said, "Let me take the wheel." And others hear voices all the time, telling them to sit under a tree or jump from a cliff, or take large baskets of eggs into Walmart. The voice of God seems to be everywhere, heard loud and clear under the rumbling of the ticker tape. And all these folk miracles and speaking gods are the mysteries left homeless by the architecture of speed and moving forward, onward, and ahead. Which is not to say that I prefer to wait for others to turn my path into a ruin. I would rather do it myself, the American way, with a second mortgage and a wrecking crew. That way I can say that I am the author of my own ruin. That's the American way. We don't whine or complain. Well, some of us do. But nobody did it to us, so you do it to me and I'll do it to you. Here the rhapsodic bard breaks into song, but since he can't sing, he goes on rhapsodizing. Each building here houses an inner demolition dictator, a household god who chews impatiently his cigar of cash and impatience, and who is not content until everyone is in their cars driving from Nowheresville to Nowheresville in search of therapy and desire. Which brings me to Portland. An intelligent city. An intelligent city, that is to say, a city with a plan. Vastly different from the swamp burg of Baton Rouge, where even the gods of demolition have moved out from boredom. They've moved out from boredom at being so well worshipped. A city that spreads itself like Houston, in the complacency of sprawl and the multiplication of TV channels. So it is Portland we admire, the city with a plan. But is this truly the place where the three architectures of nature, ruins, and imagination meet? There is nothing more deadly than a dictator with a utopian blueprint. In the perfect city, adolescents die of boredom. And for lack of complicated architectures, they might transform. At least that was the case in other perfectly planned worlds. Which brings me to the Lovejoy Ramp project. I know, it took a while. Which aptly named, Lovejoy Ramp Project, which aptly named is a serial invocation of ruins and imagination. Below the moving belly of America, a man stood still with a paintbrush that tickled commuters on the road above, who then, not knowing why, were stricken by a desire to masturbate. For years, that stretch of freeway over the Lovejoy Ramp was a favorite of drab-ranched drones, and when the columns were revealed, the Portland surreal-Dadaist sighed. Ah, now we understand. And hastened to save these life-enhancing works, and thus an unfolding drama in 3 acts. First, the act of revising architecture to the requirements of America by understanding that in the country of freeways are history. Second, in moving the great pillars with their commuter-tickling powers out of harm's way, they married the heroic to the ludic. And in the third, which has not yet been played, they will transform the decorated legs of the Colossus into a temple that, like the iron ball of Madagascar, awaits only a place to stand, so that the citizens might come inside with offerings of pâté de foie gras and fusion nouvelle cuisine. There's some there for a price. And those three acts fulfill, it seems to me, all the demands of nature, ruins, and imagination. And thus, as in a placid lake that lies within its planned warp and woof, even as the rents are going through the roof, rhyming at times, and I'll start this again. And thus, as in a placid lake that lies within its planned warp and woof, even as the rents are going through the roof, and Nessie lifts her head and scares the lonely tramp. The Dada folk of Portland break the calm by pushing up the Lovejoy ramp. The first time I ever read that poem out loud, it's like a play. It should actually be performed by about 10 people. I told you I would get to Sweden sooner or later via Portland. I was there this spring, and I don't know about, I don't hear about Lenin much anymore these days. It seems to be sort of forgotten figure. Are you freezing back there? Why don't you come close? Bring those goats to warm you up. Nobody hears about Lenin here, but in Sweden, Lenin, in Stockholm especially, Lenin is this sort of like Washington slept here figure, because he spent one of his exiles in Stockholm and stayed in various places, and for some reason they were all legendary. So I've been there 3 times now, and whenever I go, my friend Don Chafran, before I even, I get in from the airport after many hours of flying, and he immediately produces something for me. And this time he produced Lenin, and then he produced somebody else, which I will read to you, and then I'll stop for a minute. But Lenin continued, this was in March. After 20 hours of flying, before I even checked into my hotel, Dan had driven me from the airport straight to the Royal Library in Stockholm, where he works. He led me past corrals filled with silent scholars to a plain wooden table in a bare small room. It was the table where Lenin in Swedish exile worked, having signed himself in the register of 1907 as J. Frey and as Ulyanov in 1910. When I stretched my hands over the plain oak surface, polished by the hands and shirt sleeves of the founder of the Soviets, his resonant voice came booming into my brain with the command to now visit all the libraries of his many exiles and write a poem in each one of them. And since I was now in his second, the first having been the British Museum Library, where he signed in as Richter, I owed him a poem immediately. Lenin boomed with rhetorical intransigence that having read my poem about his British Library stint, that ghosts read all about themselves is little known, he had now instructed Dan Shafran in the same booming metempsychotic fashion. Well, he had now instructed Dan, in the same booming metempsychotic fashion, to hand me a folder of documents about his well-documented exiles to Sweden, which Dan did. Well-documented indeed, were the houses he'd lived in, no longer there, but photographed just before being demolished. There were others, never photographed, that had become mythical in Stockholm. Lenin had slept everywhere in Stockholm. In the Swedish version of Washington slept here, though it is known that he rarely slept and always studied. Thus, concluded the booming Lenin voice in my brain, he must now go to Zurich, to the library of my other exiles, and write another poem. I tore my hot and itching hands from the mediomatic table terrified of the enormous task before me after 20 hours of flight, and I had a brief thought that the best mediums were exiles from Lenin's utopia, people like Dan and myself, who had barely escaped the thoughts born in him in this library. And we carried photographs of those thoughts in our minds long after the utopia had been demolished. And still, Lenin, the iconic figure of our youth, broadcast well to us in the socialist kingdom of Sweden. For one thing, it wasn't far from Russia. But I didn't become truly scared, though the palms of my hands itched to the need for the poem. This poem. Until Dan told me that Soviet tourists in the 20th century, each with a flower in his hand, waited in long lines for many hours to lay this flower on Lenin's oak desk. Having traveled for days by bus direct from the Kremlin, where they had laid more flowers on his glass tomb. This was the reward for being heroes of labor. And so, with their hands calloused by steel and shovel, they tenderly laid their grateful flower on the work table of the great dead comrade for whom they had become labor heroes, and spent long nights on hard snowy roads cupping a tender flower. And here I was with my bourgeois complaint, 20 hours in flight. What is that to a century of dead tired subjects of a library scholar? Okay, said Dan, this is the 21st century. You can go to your hotel to sleep now. There's always time for a poem. Okay, and I was going to read you this other Swedish production of dance, which is about Descartes, who, I mean, this is going to become eventually a little book called Dan Chaffran's Guide to Eminent Vagabonds and Exiles in Sweden. And René Descartes apparently was one of them, and this is his story. I mean, my story, being introduced to Descartes' story. An icy day in Stockholm, even the locals say so, but Dan takes me to a graveyard surrounding an old church and points to the frigid granite profile above the door. René Descartes, in trouble with the Pope, in trouble with the Dutch, having gotten a servant girl in trouble in Amsterdam, his daughter Francine dead of scarlet fever, in trouble with Pascal, who accused him of getting rid of God, migrating from one teaching gig to another, Nassau, Bavaria, Paris, Dordrecht, never without admirers, chief among them Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, to whom he dedicated Principia Philosophiae in French in 1647, in the hope, no doubt, of a permanent roof over his head and a subsidy. René continued to vagabond, with his pen always moving, a step ahead of the Inquisition that had gotten Galileo, and thinking that he finally found the right princess, when hired to tutor Princess Christina of Sweden, who may or may not have been the right princess. He never found out. Shortly after his arrival to the palace in Stockholm, he took a philosopher's walk on an icy day and died of pneumonia. Not necessarily because of the bone-chilling wind, but because of the Protestant princess's insistence that he rise early for her lessons. He was not a morning person. After he died, he was interred in a graveyard used for unbaptized infants, because he was a Catholic in a Protestant country. After he was thus reposed, Princess Christina abdicated her throne and converted to Roman Catholicism. But she'd have done better to sleep late and learn in the afternoon. It was her schedule, not God, that killed Descartes. His books are already black indexed by the church, and as Pascal noted, René wasn't much for God. Nor did the French let him rest long. They moved his remains on an icy day, intending to bury him in the Pantheon, but meanwhile, a meanwhile that is still ongoing, he rests between two monks in the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, a Bohemian vagabond to the end. And because my teeth were chattering from the Baltic Sea wind of March 2013, 400 and some years since the author of Passions of the Soul, we went inside the church where the ushers waved us gracefully in, just as a chorus of beautiful young Swedes soared into the glorious finale of Bach's Magnificat to a great standing ovation and loud applause. "They're not applauding for you," Dan said. "I know that. They're applauding René Descartes." Well, I did promise to read you 2 short poems, which I will, and then we can talk. I mean, I have no idea how much time has gone by. Hours. Maybe.
Too much.
The thing about poetry, you know, it's just, you know, you go there, you can, sometimes you don't come back. I know many people who did that, so nobody's heard from them, so. So, I mean, actually, these 2 short works I'll read here will be, you know, up to you, because I'll give them to the universe of chance. And so if you ask me a question, I'll answer it by opening this book and reading whatever short poem pops up first. Or part of a poem, make it short. Yes. Any question? Oracular question. I'm going to use this book as an oracle because I don't know it very well. It came out not so long ago. I didn't actually collect the poems in it. My friend and publisher Alan Kornblum did, and he did a great job, I think, because every time I look at it, I'm startled by these things, and I think, oh, well, I must have written them at some point or another. But so you'll be just as good as editors as you know as anybody else. So any questions, like whatever.
An oracular question: should we go to war with Syria?
Yeah, should we go to war with Syria? Well, I'm going to let the book answer it because my answer is really no. But I emigrated to Detroit from Sibiu, Romania in 1966 after spending 1 year in transit in Italy. I spoke no English, but I understood my contemporaries and felt that their anger was mine as we headed for the year 1968 in Chicago, Paris, and Prague. So, you know, probably the answer is people are angry, so probably not, actually. According to that.
That was the right answer.
No. It's a book, I mean, come on. Any other question? Maybe more trivial? I mean, something doesn't make me think.
How are beignets?
What's that?
How are beignets?
How are beignets? Okay. Blackout. I love beignets because they always eat them at the Café du Monde and they cover you in sugar, you know, and you look like you just came from an all-night cocaine party. Beignets or blackout. It all started when they turned off the Eiffel Tower. After I had decided that ecstasy precludes contentment, I slipped down the narrow stairs at 121 Rue Lauriston and re-injured my left wing. Among the healthy pigeons of Paris, here is one slightly askew. That's a good answer. You know, beignets are just these French donuts, you know. That's what Whitman called them, you know. It's in his diary of New Orleans when Walt Whitman was lived in New Orleans just after the Civil War, and he was writing for the New Orleans papers, and one of his lines about Café du Monde, which was there then, he said, was had French donuts at Café du Monde. So, yeah.
Do you ever write anything in Romanian?
Oh yeah, I do. And I have a book here, which I'm going to read to you in its entirety. Actually, I wrote a really terrific, the first, I do now, you know, I mean, I used to, when I was, you know, when I started writing, I wrote in Romanian, but then for the first time in, oh, I don't know, in 30 years, I wrote a poem in collaboration with a Romanian poet, Roxandra Cesarean, we wrote it by email, and it's called The Forgiven Submarine. It was her title, and I had no idea, I still don't know what The Forgiven Submarine is, but, you know, we wrote this terrific work together that was, you know, partly started out being a sort of a love poem, but then it turned into a resentment poem. Then it turned into a battle, you know, over aesthetics, you know, then it turned into a battle between genders, everything, you know, everything is in this poem, in Romanian, for the first time. And it's a, you know, it's a terrific way to come back into the language, you know, fighting in this particular way. But I mean, in a very poetic, real way, because we became very obsessed with this poem, both of us. And then I translated it back into English. And her Romanian was easier for me to translate than my own. My own gave me a lot of trouble. It's called The Forgiven Submarine. It was published about, well, first it was published in Romania bilingually, and then it was published by Black Widow Press about 4 years ago, also bilingually, but in my translation into English. I know it sounds totally weird, but, you know, it's at that point that I sort of thought that I became bilingual again. I mean, perfectly bilingual, you know, that I was so mad at her that we could actually write in Romanian without knowing that I was writing in Romanian. Yeah, I was just writing. And then later I thought, well, I just wrote that in Romanian. And I now do now and then. I mean, I have a correspondence with a number of people, but not poems. I mean, you know, poems are a strange thing. Because every time I write in Romanian poems, I think I'm 16. Which is great, but, you know.
Can you read for us in Romanian? Can you read a poem?
Well, I would if I actually had that book I was speaking of. So, I don't. There aren't actually. The only line in Romanian in here is in the first poem in this book. It's an Ars Poetica, actually, for dedicated to a Canadian French surrealist German poet, Ludwig Zoller. Yeah, now I'll just read that. The first line is the cool view by the cooler, and the next line is in Romanian, which was O altă mărie cu aceeași pălărie, which is a Romanian saying for the same thing, the same person with a different hat. To translate that loosely. So there is your Romanian. It's insufficient, I'm sure, but you know, I wasn't prepared for that. Oh, that's so. Read it again, please. Well, any other questions? I mean, I'll be happy to answer them without the book, if the book scares you. I mean, it scares me, so... So I know we have a few minutes, because I don't know. Michelle, you have a watch, actually.
Plenty of time.
Plenty of time? She has the watch that says plenty of time. Can you rewind that, please? Yes. Oh yeah, that's right, it's Yom Kippur. Well, happy Yom Kippur. You're supposed to actually apologize to the world for everything you've done wrong. And I do, and I would more so if I could remember. I mean, I know that I've done many things wrong, including this book. I mean, you know, writing poems is a crime. Writing is a crime. Anybody who's ever written anything actually should apologize right now. Language is a crime, you know, or anyway, it's a cover-up, okay? Not a crime, but a cover-up of a crime. So you can go ahead and Yom Kippur your typing technologies and your pen. Yeah, I mean, that's, isn't, I mean, Rosh Hashanah is for apologizing personally to people you've wronged, but Yom Kippur you sort of make a universal apology, right? You're just sorry for everything. And I am, I mean, I was, well, except for a few things. Oh, I don't know, like certain, out of time experiences, I'm not sorry for at all, and I could never say they were right or wrong, because they didn't happen within Christian, Jewish time terminology.
You wrote a book a long time ago about avatars before I had ever heard of them. How did you know about them?
Well, I mean, if you're from Romania, you're sort of 1,000 years older automatically than everybody else. So, before you get to know anybody, they send their avatars to you. So before your mother and father actually introduce themselves to you, they send an avatar. That are the ideal mother and father. And so then you meet the real people, but you always remember the avatars. They are primordial. I know that the computer people called these impersonations of their, of their cyber persona avatars, but it was one of those things in which they actually sort of almost got it right. Just like the people who named particles quarks almost sort of got it right. They were borrowing them, So avatars are just this, these sort of wishful, ideal figures that come first, and then the reality introduces itself, and then you have a perfectly Newtonian universe. Except for the avatars, who you remember and may show up now and then. But I didn't, when I wrote that book, it's called Messiah, but it's, in Romania actually they did it right, because the title was Messiah, but the AH they made into the at of the computer, like in the address, like at at Gmail. So it was M-E-S-S-I and the symbol. And they got it right, because all those avatars in that book, they come via the cyber waves, and of course, when I was writing it, it was sort of novel, but it was clearly already in the air. Well, not just in the air, but my friend Linda Stone in Seattle, who showed me the first virtual worlds that she was then working on, it's about 100 people who spoke, techno babble. Her worlds were these figures that you picked, these avatars you picked from a menu. You could design your own, and then they went to different environments and different designed places, and they talked like cartoon characters with bubbles over their heads, and you just typed in what they said. And so you're in a bar, let's say, like in, Cheers or something, and you talk to everybody. But then if you wanted to have a private conversation with someone, then you could type in dotted lines over their heads and balloons. And that was interesting, but VR virtual environments like that never quite took off in that form. The gaming people were working on things like that, and they got pretty good at it, but they kind of separated from reality, because they were games and they stayed games, and people do those things, with their hands, and they confuse reality and that other stuff, the little design things. But they were not. The conceit in the book that these things could really come through and just get real. At a certain point, which is probably true. We're only 15 seconds from that.
One more question.
Yes.
Have you ever written any poem you said you did
Sorry.
in any other languages?
Don't say poem. Well, yeah, I've written in all the languages. I once spoke perfect Japanese on acid with a Japanese person. But no, I have written actually. What's that?
The haiku?
No, it wasn't a haiku actually.
No, you were going to give us one.
I wrote that?
You promised.
Oh, haiku, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Something short, please.
Did I say haiku? I should ask Ken, actually. Ken is the master of the short poem, right? I don't know how to shut up. But I did write a haiku, actually. Oh yeah, well here's one, but it's from a longer poem. You can't be a bit superstitious and a bit rational. A little in a book and a little outside. No, that's not right. It's an inconclusive haiku. I wrote actually this will answer all your questions. It's called one syllable, and it's not actually one syllable, but what a haiku. It's 25 minutes long. No, it's not. It's called one syllable. And it answers the question about other languages too, actually. The translation machine on Mount Athos has multiple portals for mortals and one for eternity. It comes and goes on its self-devouring path, leaving behind critical self-sufficiency to doom posterity. I won't be doomed. Boom, boom. Can you believe just how much work it is to deconstruct a world that was read by everybody in their own language, that there are many languages and not one for you? Ubu, Dada, Yahoo, Bing, Google, Wiki. In the kingdom of the one syllable, check the weather. It comes from the outside. Okay, it's good. Okay, well, thank you very much.